Today on the podcast, I talked with Carrie Woodward. She is a fellow board certified behavior analyst, and we actually discuss another podcast. Dr. Huberman has a podcast called the Huberman Lab. And if you don't know who he is a neuroscientist out of California. He works in Stanford, and he has one of the most popular podcasts that exists. He is a scientist, and he wants to bring science to the public. Same, love the topic. And he did a really amazing podcast all about autism. And so today we're just breaking down and kind of giving you a little summary of what is talked about in that podcast. I also have a link if you want to listen to the full podcast as well. He has 7 million followers on Instagram and across various social media platforms. He really is just amazing at sharing and disseminating information, not just about autism, about any type of scientific topic. So this one discusses autism. We talk all about what did they discuss about autism diagnosis? Does it seem like the incidence rate is higher than it used to be? We get into that. We also talk a lot about the rationale for early detection, and we talk about what interventions they suggest too. And what I thought was so interesting is what age is too young? Is there an age that's too young for autism intervention or intervention that's going to help our students become more independent communicators and more independent across their day? I'm very excited for this episode, and let's get into my discussion with Carrie Woodward.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Today, we have a great show for you today. We have with us Carrie Woodward, and I was just mentioning that I've seen Carrie all over my social media because she is out there sharing and disseminating information. So I'm excited to be able to connect with you live today. For those that don't know you or haven't get on the Carrie Woodward algorithm like I have on social media, can you tell us a little bit about you and your background and just your journey into the field?
Sure. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I'm a board certified behavior analyst, and I actually got started in the autism world when I was an undergrad in college. When I was a sophomore, it was like the first real job I ever had, was doing ABA with little kids. And I absolutely just fell in love with it. And I sort of realized then and there that this was going to be where my career. And so I've had I've worked in the same field for my whole adult life. And I, a couple of years ago, was a clinical director at an agency, Southern California, and, loved my job, but also had 2 kids in 2 years. And so I just sort of hit a wall with being able to manage the demands of life and work all together. So I stepped away from that job. But I knew like I needed to find something else in this arena because this is where my passion is. And so it was a personal experience with a friend of mine who was going through a son who was a bit delayed in their development, and sort of helping her navigate that. I realized that like we were missing so much for parents at this stage. We know that there's something going on with development. We're not really ready for a referral for a diagnostic assessment yet. We're on wait list, and there's just nothing out there. And like I had done this with kids this age in my work, and I just was like, okay, this is where I'm called to be. And so I started just filming educational videos for Autism Jumpstart was the name of my company that I came up with. And so, I create educational videos for parents, and then also, materials to help them at this stage in their journey with autism.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I love that because I have 3 kids. And so my career has really been dictated because I wanted to try to find this, I don't know if it's a real thing, but work-life balance. I'm actually going to do a podcast episode on kind of my journey in the summer because I feel like I'm always striving to try to find that. And it's hard, right? It's very hard. So I can understand, being clinically how hard that was.
Absolutely.
So when did you start your own business, Autism Jumpstart?
I mean, like technically the January 1st, 2024 is like the start of my company. I've been doing videos on social media for about a year. And I finished building a course for parents that has only really been around for about 4 months now.
Oh, okay.
So this is all pretty new.
That's amazing. Okay. Very exciting. Yes. ABA Speech started 7 years ago. So it has just been a journey, and you meet so many people. So I'm excited. I'm excited for you. I did see, in talking about what we were going to discuss today, I saw on your website that you have a CEU as a BCBA reaction to the Huberman podcast on autism. And I feel like I know who Huberman is because he has one of the top rated podcasts, but I feel like I think I saw him on TikTok. Maybe that's, am I embarrassed to say that? I think that's where I learned about him, because he would maybe have his podcast clips on there. But it is a very, very popular podcast. But I was having dinner with my friends this past week, and I realized, and they're kind of in this field, and they have never heard of Huberman. They don't know who he is. And he's really, if you know, he's got millions and millions of followers on all the socials. But for people that are not familiar with the Huberman Lab podcast, can you just give us a little bit of background on him and what that podcast covers? Because he's out in California, right? Stanford.
Yeah, he's out of Stanford. He's a neuroscientist out of Stanford, a neuroscientist and ophthalmologist, a doctor of ophthalmology.
Wow.
And he's been around for a long time. I know that. And I had followed, I'm a science nerd, like I'm a behavioral scientist. So that when that popped up on my YouTube algorithm feed, I was like, oh, I'm interested in hearing what he has to say about sleep or about, so he always is popping up. But his mission, when he talks about his mission, is disseminating science to the masses, because not enough people contact science on a daily basis. And a lot of times scientists are really bad about explaining science in a way that's understandable for people who do not have a PhD in that field, And so I was super excited to see, just on my homepage on YouTube, that he had done an episode on autism, because I was already familiar with his work and really appreciated the way that he explains things. But then I was so excited to see that he had another scientist out of Stanford come on, and they spent 3 hours just talking about autism and her research, really more geared toward like the biomechanics of autism. So some of those biological markers that they're looking for, that they can find for consistency in autism diagnoses.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if she was also from Stanford, because I had
She is.
Okay, it might have been the person I reached out to, but she did actually respond to one of my emails. There was actually this line of research that came out with very small children, and it was about eye gaze, like babies, and it was an indicator of autism. And I think her last name was Pierce, and I reached out to her last summer, and she said, "I'm very busy. You can reach back out to me." And I did. And then I didn't hear anything. But she was on the Huberman Lab podcast. So I was like, this is of a different playing field. Maybe I'll reach back out. But I think it's interesting because I love that. And I was just telling Carrie before I pressed record that I was listening to one of Huberman's podcasts on sleep. And I did think it was interesting. He had somebody else on that was very, very smart. And most of the podcast was very easy to understand. And then it got a little too nerdy even for me. And so I had to skip ahead. But he does make it, for the most part, very digestible, which I love that, because if you spend any time on social media, there's so much that's not science that's being thrown around. And I actually did look at the comments under the marketing for the autism podcast, and there were just a lot of like nasty comments. And I was like, per the usual, I was not surprised by that at all. But it's funny. So is life.
Pokes the bear.
So you have the CEU, which is really cool, kind of about this reaction to listening to that podcast. So for those of us that haven't heard the podcast, I thought it'd be neat if we kind of summarize it here today, because it's kind of cutting edge research. So what did they share on the podcast about autism diagnosis and prognosis?
So specifically about diagnosis, one of the main questions that you hear a lot is are the incidence rates of autism increasing, or have we just gotten better for screening? And so her name is Karen Parker, Dr. Parker. She talks about it being both, that there really is probably an increase in the rates of, there are more children that are receiving a diagnosis, not just because we're better, but then we also have become better, more aware. There are standard screening tools that every pediatrician should be going through with parents at their checkups. So those things that weren't around 20 years ago now are. So we have a lot more kids, but also we're catching a lot of kids who maybe would have sort of fallen through the cracks 20 years ago and not actually gotten a formal diagnosis. They really didn't go into prognosis. They talk a lot about, where we need to go in terms of identifying early detection, why that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
And then they spent a significant chunk of time really on her research, specifically about a hormone called vasopressin, which I can talk about a little bit later.
Okay.
A lot on prognosis.
Yeah. Okay. So what did they share? Obviously, we know what the rationale is for early detection, but what did they share kind of publicly, for a lay person, why early detection is so important?
So I loved this piece of it because this is really where I started and why I feel so passionately about doing what I'm doing, which is this understanding of brain plasticity. As a behavior analyst, we don't do a lot of study and research or learning about the brain specifically in our grad programs, right? But as you start to sort of dive in and understand how the brain works and why, I was like, why is early intervention so successful? Like, what is it that's the core mechanism of why it's such a critical piece for these autistic kids who have good long-term outcomes? And it all goes down to brain plasticity, that in the first 3 years of life, the brain is sort of setting up its wiring, and it's very plastic and malleable, meaning it's very easy to change and adapt. And so we have a lot less work to do in order to sort of help set up and establish the good neural connections, especially the ones that underlie social connection, which, we all know about the diagnosis, and that social deficit is one of those main core features. And that if we can really get in and do some good work in the first 3 years, there is a chance that we can rewire the social circuitry and basically open up the world of learning for autistic kids. So that's why early detection is so important. She does talk a lot about, unfortunately, areas that are lower income or lower socioeconomic status. Their kids get diagnoses on average years after kids who are in wealthier areas. And so they talked a little bit about a couple of different screening tools that, are still being researched, but I think there's hope that in the next couple of years, I just read an article on, the research was training an AI model to essentially do a retina scan. And they trained the AI by giving it, 75 ADOS scores. So ADOS is the tool that we use to diagnose autism. Right. And then the corresponding retina scan for that ADOS score. And they had a group of autistic kids and a group of non-autistic kids. And that's how the model learned. And then they gave the AI 25 retina scans and basically asked it to predict, and it predicted 100% accuracy, the kids that had the diagnosis of autism. And so, I think that there is a lot of stuff that's still in the research phase, but that hopefully we're going to be able to start disseminating more and more, so that kids can just get screened earlier, because even the kids who we know are exhibiting signs might not even be able to get an appointment for a diagnostic assessment for another 8 months, 10 months, a year. Right. And then we're just pushed out of that window for brain plasticity. So the earlier that we can flag, even like that there's an elevated risk factor for these kids, that the better off everybody's going to be.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah. So what's interesting as a speech therapist, we have to take a human anatomy class in undergrad. And then we have to take a graduate program about anatomy of the speech and hearing mechanism. But we learn all about the brain and about neuroplasticity. And that is really something I think we need in our coursework. I'm always thinking of things that we don't take coursework in. Right. But what also is sad, and what makes me so mad and frustrated, is there's so much dissemination on Instagram, and specifically probably TikTok too, about things that are pseudoscience that we don't have a lot of research for. And so there are parents that are out there that hear that, they get on the wrong side of Instagram and they find out that ABA is bad. That's what all the people that are making videos say. Yep. And then with this idea that early intervention is so important, they may think that, there's actually some people out there that think we shouldn't even provide any intervention, that we should just let people be. And I just think ethically I know that you agree with me, but I think that ethically that's really wrong. Yeah. And it's sad because the people that need to hear that are not going to hear that information. They're just bombarded with all of this pseudoscience. And I really think that there are going to be people in 5 years that have students who are not able to communicate functionally, are not able to use the restroom by themselves, are not able to follow simple one-step directions because they're not listening to this scientific information. Right. They're listening to other stuff. And I think that's sad, isn't it?
Oh God. And the picture that's painted about ABA is that we're going in and we're changing these kids, that we're modifying who they are at their core.
Right.
And I think, if we could just pull back the curtain a little bit, and just show that like we're playing, we're having fun, we are building value in social engagement so that kids are socially motivated, because if you have kids who are socially motivated, they are going to learn. And, when you have adult autistic people who are very successful in life, who are going on and saying, I'm fine and I didn't do an early intervention, so therefore nobody should need it. It just ignores this giant population, not just the profoundly autistic population, but a lot of kids who wouldn't even meet the criteria for profound autism, but that really needed some help in being able to start learning a bit more naturally and just paying attention to their environment, and helping them be more successful. I had somebody on social media actually kind of say, if you guys could just show your therapy, it would be a lot easier for everybody else. And I'm like, we're bound by so many. I don't know how there are other professions that are showing so many videos of their kids in therapy. Like,
they are.
I know the confidentiality risks and our certification. It's
I know.
Do that.
I know. I will never do that. Now I do, if it's a parent account, I have a parent that I'm friends with and she's a BCBA and she's been sharing videos of her son. So I shared those videos on my account, but I just always felt funny about showing client videos just on social media. If it's a parent and they're on my email list or they're a brand ambassador for me, we've done that in the past, but I agree. I just feel funny about that. And maybe it's that I teach the ethics class here at Kent State and I have for 6 years. So maybe, darn it, I think I'm just too ethical. I can't do it. I don't need all the followers, but it does get tricky.
Yes.
Because it feels kind of icky to me to see that. And I do try to be I love Dr. Hanley. We actually did talk on direct messages on Instagram. Yay for that. And I'm hoping to have him on the podcast. He does know who I am. He knows I exist. So that was a good day for me. But he has this idea of being televisable. And I like that idea of the open door policy because yes, we talk about these generalities of ABA being helpful, but we know that there are providers that are utilizing antiquated interventions, right? And that's what's nice about your platform is that you're sharing that it's not like that, that you can provide ABA in a different way. So I know what you're saying, though. I do feel funny about the people that show every single therapy session that they're holding at their clinic. I know you see those too on Instagram.
Yeah. And here's the thing. It would be great PR for the field of behavior analysis. Yeah. And quite frankly, we would have a lot better behavior analysts if there was more visibility of really, really good ABA therapy, of it being delivered in a way that is 5-star. Right. And unfortunately, that's just not how it is. People are learning in, the agency that they got their job at, and they're people who are their mentors. And you sort of see family style, my graduate advisor was a student of Jack Michael's. And so verbal behavior was really big in our practice. So you sort of see these family trees of behavior analysis, who did you study with and who did they study with? And that's how it gets. If we did have more visibility, more televisability, it would, I bet people would love to watch Dr. Hanley do his work and really see how to do a really good, his ISCA. So yeah, I agree with you. The workaround is really tricky for ethics, and I'm a rule follower. And so
did you hear that, BACB? We're rule followers. Don't come after us. Don't include our names in a journal article, please. That's a whole other show. So, okay. I love that. So I'm curious because I did not listen to this episode because I knew you were going to review it for me. What interventions on that Huberman Lab podcast what did they discuss as far as intervention? I'm really curious what they talked about.
They left it very vague. They basically just said, there was a brief conversation just about capturing the neuroplasticity and how Dr. Huberman asked her, how young is too young for behavioral intervention? So they really just call it behavioral intervention. And she says, there's a number of different behavioral interventions that, we can utilize, and that there really isn't a too young. There are studies, they call them baby sibling studies, where they take younger siblings of kids who already have an autism diagnosis. And because autism is so hereditary, there's a higher likelihood that a younger sibling is going to receive that diagnosis. So pre-diagnosis, they're giving this sort of preemptive or proactive behavioral intervention to these younger siblings. And there's actually, I just read a research article that was like 14 out of the 15 participants who were showing, the younger siblings were showing signs of autism at a 6 month to 8 month range, that they did this intensive behavioral intervention with these younger siblings, and that 14 out of 15 did not ever receive a diagnosis of autism. Now, correlation, causation, it wasn't that well controlled to be able to say,
Right.
but we do know that we're seeing a lot of positive outcomes for really young kids. And so again, that just goes back to what can we be doing to get these kids that before they're 3.5 and 4 years old and actually getting that formal diagnosis.
Well, yeah, we're starting, I have a membership, the ABA Speech Connection, which is for speech therapists and BCBAs. And we have parents in there too. And so we're starting a special parent portal where we're going to do a monthly Q&A. And I have a BCBA who is raising an autistic son, and she has two sons who are not autistic, and she's going to do the Q&As, and she's going to do a video every month, because I feel like there's so many specific questions that parents have. And just like you said, parents may be put on a wait list, or they may not have a speech therapist in their area. And so it gets really tricky on, well, how do I get started now? Because we know as providers that early intervention is so very important for that trajectory of growth. Not to say that it's too late if a child is older, because I worked in non-public programs for many years, and I would meet students who were just not around robust interventions that were evidence-based, and they really made a lot of progress. But you just don't want kids to not be able to communicate functionally and, just go through life independently. So I like that idea about just the early detection, why that's so important, why early intervention is so important. And it can just be really tricky, especially for families that are living abroad too. They may not have access to BCBAs. They may have autism schools, but not everybody is licensed appropriately. I do this monthly consult with this wonderful BCBA in Pakistan, and she's just the best BCBA ever. And, there's just other autism schools that people are not licensed like that, but it's hard for parents to know, and consumers, like, what is a good service and what is not. So, it's tricky. Very tricky.
And that leads sort of into Dr. Parker's research, because she's studying the biomarkers, right? Because if there was a consistent biomarker that could lead to other testing that may be able to be done in infancy, right? Like that we wouldn't be having to wait for a certain age marker for the behavioral observations that are needed for our types of assessment and diagnosis. And so that's kind of where she began her research, and looking to see how are the kids different on the inside in a consistent way that we would be able to flag at an earlier age.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be amazing if it was just part of like the testing that happens when somebody's born, or when somebody goes for all those visits that you have to go to for your doctor.
Yes.
Those are always hard. Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. I love that. So I know that you have a course called Jumpstart the Journey. Is that correct? Can you tell us a little bit about your, you said that kind of why you started the course, but can you tell us a little bit about who the course is for, how long it is, and what you cover?
Yes. Okay. So I designed the course for parents who have young kids who are delayed in their development, may not necessarily be ready for that referral for a diagnosis, or maybe you're going through the diagnosis, or maybe just got the diagnosis and haven't started formal treatment. So it's not a replacement for formal ABA intervention, or speech therapy. Like you want to be on the wait list for those. But what I found was that you have all these parents in this window of time where we know that the brain is sort of peaked for learning. And then they're just sitting there waiting. And there's so much that we can teach parents how to do to be able to start sort of establishing better social motivation. So the course is a video course. It's about 4 hours total, but it's broken down into really small little module segments. And I sort of crafted it based on, I dove into the research on early intervention. I dove into the research on natural behavioral developmental interventions, NDBIs. And then just took from my practice, my 20 years of experience, of what were the things that were really working, what were the core things that we could do at this early age. And part of that is simply like building and establishing social stimuli as reinforcers, so that kids are more drawn to look where they are. We look at reinforcers, and we know that social consequences do not serve as well as reinforcement for autistic kids as they do for neurotypical kids. So when you think about traditional childhood learning, It's happening through kids observing and imitating, and it's happening through social consequences being delivered, and that's strengthening those, behaviors that the kids are engaging in. And so when we think about an autistic kid, where we have the research that shows they're not looking at people as much, right? They're spending significantly less time looking at people than a neurotypical kid. So they're not even as available for learning because they're not watching and imitating. Mm-hmm. And then, we have parents delivering social consequences that they would for any kid, their kid. They just think, oh, good job, or wow, or smiles. And those things aren't functioning as reinforcement for those kids. So then even if learning does happen, it's not being reinforced. And what we know about that is that behavior is, not going to repeat again in the future. Mm-hmm. And so, I just was like, okay, there are so many things that we can teach parents how to play with their kids and just bring focus and attention on building, looking at people into this fun experience so that we're establishing people as reinforcement. We're establishing people as this is where you look up because this is where learning is happening. And then just sort of basic verbal behavior, introduction to language building, how parents can begin just pairing and joining in with their kids babbling and starting some basic imitation, so that we're essentially taking advantage of this window of time so that it's not just wasted time. And then we're creating foundation skills that are going to take this child into a formal treatment program and essentially, hopefully, completely change their trajectory because they're coming in available for learning because they're looking more. They're picking up on the learning opportunities that are being presented naturally in their environment, which is that's one of the biggest downfalls for our kids and how the delays compound on each other because they're just not looking and paying attention enough to capture all of the learning that's happening from people. And then I, just luckily I have two kids. I have a 4 and a 6-year-old. So I used them a lot to sort of model these different play exercises that we can do because my kids are neurotypical, but the way that you can play and engage and build value in sort of waiting for them to look up at you was something that was easily modelable and I think valuable for parents to see how it's supposed to look when they're going to sit down with their kid and start to read a book or play.
Oh, that's wonderful. I use my kids sometimes too. I'm like, oh, look at this. This is joint attention. And look,
exactly.
you were 6 months here. Oh, wonderful. Well, I love that. Available for learning. That is really powerful. Thank you so much, Carrie, for coming on the show. It was great to connect today.
Pleasure. It was such a nice to connect and meet you and get an opportunity to share.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.